I can't make you do anything. But if you don't catch my enthusiasm, you are just dead inside. Okay. It's not easy, though. I totally acknowledge that. Okay, so last thing we're going to cover on skin is just aging and burns. So aging. So basically, how does your skin change throughout your life? Well, it's pretty much on an upsweep until you hit your 20s, and then it's pretty much headed down after that. You got like a few years in the middle of your 20s, in which it's just like holding steady, and then it starts to go down. So what happens slowly and progressively as you age is first, dermatitis becomes more common. What's dermatitis? Irritation, generalized inflammation of the skin. It just gets pissy more easily. Less lubrication because of reduced sebaceous gland activity. Now, that means what about your skin? It's going to be drier. It's going to be drier. Now, there is one good thing about that. If you, during your adolescence, had really oily skin and hated it, you're probably going to age better than the rest of us because you're going to have a lot more moisture a little later. And that's really good, right? Because that means that instead of being good looking at 18, and honestly, everybody's pretty good looking at 18. It's not that freaking hard. You're going to be good looking at 50. And that is rare. There are also fewer Langerhans cells. Do you remember what Langerhans cells are? Those are immune cells. There are fewer Langerhans cells in your skin, which means you're more likely to get infections than you used to be. Collagen and elastic fibers, what happens is they break down slowly, and then as you age, they don't replace as readily. So your protein synthesis will slow down for collagen and elastic. And that means your skin will lose its pliability and its elasticity. And remember that collagen is helping you resist gravity, right? So as your collagen breaks down, what happens?
You get bingo wings.
Bingo wings? Is that what those are? Yeah. Bingo wings. That's pretty funny. And you start getting wrinkles. The melanocytes will also decrease. What does that generally mean about your skin color as you age? Tends to get lighter. You guys have to stop talking. Yep. Okay. Sweat production will also decrease. That means what about your thermoregulation capacity? Yeah, so when elderly people get overheated, they have a very hard time cooling down for a lot of reasons. Their sweat production decreases, and you're not as responsive to vasoconstriction and vasodilation as well. What?
I think it's rarely a problem. They're always freezing.
Yeah, they are always freezing. I mean, except if you're in the middle of Georgia with no air conditioning, then who are the first people who die when the air conditioning goes out? It's the elderly people are the first ones to die. Vitamin D production will decrease. What does that do?
Bones.
Bones, exactly. It causes problems with calcium absorption. You start losing your bone mass. Body fat deposition will change again. So what we saw last time is that you go from this, let's say you're a girl. You go from this at 7, right, to this at 20, right? And then when you hit menopause, your estrogen will drop close to 0 again. And that happens anywhere between your 40s and your 60s, really. And then you will go right back to that. You start putting body fat around the middle again. And evolutionarily, that actually is significant because if you think about what that body fat deposition is communicating to the opposite gender, it also has to do with fertility. So when your body is shaped like this, it is, without your agreement, trying to tell the opposite sex that you are sexually viable, right? That you can make some babies, right? And if you got the, right? And then, so it communicates to them, and they don't even realize they're getting the message, but they are getting the message. They are. And then what happens after you hit menopause is you start communicating something very different, right? And that communication is, I am no longer sexually viable. I can no longer make any babies for you. And women hate that because, like, then, right, you're like, I am not done, I promise you. Like, I'm smarter than ever. I have a nice car. I got some good jokes, right? And also, I can't get knocked up, right? It's amazing. But that's not me. I'm not there yet. But it's just kind of tragic, especially since we used to live such short lifespans, right? That menopause was really at the end of life. And now it's totally not. If you had menopause in your 40s, you could live until your 90s, and then you would spend the majority of your life postmenopausal. Body fat deposition will change, your skin will thin, and so that also makes you more susceptible to temperature changes. And then let's go back to our sort of sun and aging thing. So dermatologists say the 90% rule. 90% of skin aging is due to sun exposure, 90% of it. And so in order to get an appreciation for that, let's talk about aging in dark skin versus light skin people. And let's take two extremes. Let's say we've got someone of African descent with really inherently very dark skin, right? And we've got someone of Nordic descent with really inherently light skin, right? And I want to fast forward both of these women until they're 60, right? And tell me what the difference is going to be in the aging of their skin. The woman with inherently dark skin is going to look at 60 about the same way she looked at 35, honestly. And it's because she is constantly protecting the deeper layers of her skin with the collagen and elastic from UV damage, right? You have an inherent protection from UV damage when your skin is dark. And the person with light skin does not have that inherent protection. So you are getting little bits of UV damage. Even if you never tan, you certainly do experience UV radiation whenever you're going outside. So aging is dramatically different in dark skin versus light skin people. And that's not even, of course, thinking about the cancer risks. But in addition, within people, you can actually directly see the impact of skin aging. So we looked at this one last time, right? And this is a phenomenal, scientific study, have the perfect control right there, right? It's just two different environmental stimuli. So this is the truck driver guy with two different environmental stimuli. The only other thing that's almost as good as this is that every year in, I think it's called Twinsville, Iowa, Ohio, Idaho, I can't always get those states mixed up. So there's a place called Twinsville, and every year they have a huge convention of twins. All the twins come. So some enterprising young doctors decided that's a phenomenal place to go to start gathering some data, and they did. And so identical genetics, identical environment up until adulthood, and look at the difference between the two of them. This is this hyperpigmentation, and the wrinkling that you can see in the skin is due to sun exposure. These are the same women from the side. You can see increase in lines and hyperpigmentation, and this is all just because of sun exposure. So this is always very useful to talk about because you can always start now protecting your skin, right? I'm really trying to talk to adolescent Melanie to tell her to not put baby oil and iodine on your skin and go lay on the tin roof. Don't do that, right? So you guys aren't going to do that, and you're going to wear sunscreen, and you're going to be the best looking old people in the history of old people, right? That is the sun and aging. Okay, and then last thing to talk about is just briefly talk about burns, just because I want to relate that whole thing that you hear about all the time. First, second, third degree burns. You've heard of that a million times. So what do those have to do with the architecture of the skin that we talked about? A first degree burn will only damage the epidermis. A second degree burn will damage the epidermis and part of the dermis. Okay? And a third degree burn damages all the way through the dermis. It might even crackle the fat in the subcutaneous tissue, right? So first and second degree burns are called partial thickness burns for obvious reasons, and full thickness burn is a third degree burn. So let's just talk briefly about the symptoms. So what are the symptoms of a first degree burn?
Red.
Yeah, it's just red, right? So it could be a sunburn or a steam burn, right? If you open a pot too fast and you get a steam burn, right? So, but the difference is that if I have a steam burn versus a sunburn, the sunburn has both burn and UV radiation, right? So this one is worse potentially, right? Okay. And then a second degree burn has blistering associated with it. What happens with a second degree burn is the epidermis pulls away from the dermis, and you've got inflammatory fluid that builds up between them. But something cool about that is that if I touch the surface of the blister on the superficial surface, does it hurt? No, it doesn't hurt because it's the epithelial tissue, right? And it pulls away from the only sensory receptors that were in it, which were running through the dermis, right? You pull them away, and then you can poke anything you want onto the superficial surface of a blister at any time. The tissue under the blister has all of the sensation, not the tissue on top of the blister, which is primarily keratin. Okay, so that's a second-degree burn, and a third-degree burn is going to have an increased likelihood of fibrosis. It damages all the way through, okay? It could even crackle the fat, and it damages the entire skin. So you know how they say that you've got third-degree burns over 82% of your body, or 72% of your body, or whatever they say. How do they know? Because they don't measure it, because ouch, right? That would suck, as if you weren't having a bad enough day. Somebody's going to measure your burns. What they do is just based on adult body proportions versus child body proportions. We know how much skin proportionally is on upper limbs, lower limbs, those kinds of things. And they just estimate. But it's different for adults and children, because kids, of course, have their limbs count for less skin. They have kind of bigger torsos proportionally, and their heads are big. So a head of a baby is about 18% of the skin, but of an adult, it's only about 9% of the skin. So what happens is your head is almost the same size it's going to be as at an adult by the time you're about 2.5 or 3 years old. And then you just grow into your big old melon, right? I bet some of you people were big-headed children, were you? Right? My son was like such a big-headed child. It was the cutest thing. He had a perfectly square head. It's just like like somebody out of like, not Bob's Burgers. What's the one with the kid with the football head? Stewie, the football head. Yeah, Family Guy. His head was enormous, and I was a little afraid, but it was really cute. And then he just grew into it, and he doesn't like me to talk about it anymore. Whatever. I'm the mom. So last thing is, what are some things that you can do for burns? Well, you can do grafting, right? If you have a burn. So there's a couple different kinds of grafts. If I do a graft to myself, it's called an autograft. So let's say I've got a big burn on my arm. I can do an autograft from someplace in my body. And what you do is take little chunks of skin. What I'm really trying to do is avoid fibrosis, right? Because fibrosis will reduce mobility at joints, for instance, right? And of course, you lose functionality with fibrosis as well. So what if I took a couple little chunks of skin from elsewhere and put them in here? Then they're small enough that I don't do fibrosis over here, and I reduce the likelihood of fibrosis over here. That's okay, but if I've got third-degree burns over large percentages of my body, autografts are really not going to be possible. The other thing that I can do is allografts, and allografts historically, a lot of times they come, believe it or not, the foreskin of circumcised little baby boys is donated, whether you knew it or not, for laboratory work, and they grow up the cells, and you don't actually have foreskin that you put on you. You have cells that were grown up from foreskin, and they can actually grow those up and use them for allografts, which means it comes from another human. Or this is even more common now, at least in this country, using cadaver skin. It sounds super grody, but it's actually kind of cool. So what they do is I've got a big wound, right? And remember that if you have a big wound, then regeneration is going to happen at the edges, right? But fibrosis will try to happen in the middle. And what I want is to reduce fibrosis. So here's what they do. If I'm an organ donor, and I am, one of the organs that I might be donating when I'm done is my skin. And what they do is they take the skin and they plane it out. So even from a little bitty piece of skin, you can get big, large amounts of it. And so what they do is they take this cadaver skin and they put it in the wound as a placeholder. And then they let regeneration happen at the edges. And then they take the cadaver skin out and put a smaller piece in as a placeholder, and then let it occur toward the middle until, do you actually end up with very much cadaver skin on you? No, I mean, you probably got a few of the cells, right? But you don't really end up, it's just kind of a placeholder to keep fibrosis from occurring. So, and that's kind of cool. Heterograft comes from a different organism, pigs, maybe. It doesn't happen very often in this country anymore. And then artificial skin is really cool. So what they figured out, this is so cool, I love smart people. So now what they've figured out is one of the other things you can do is a skin that's partially artificial. So what they do is they make the connective tissue matrix, think mesh. Um, and you know that there are surgical sutures that will dissolve in the body. So what you do is instead of making a line out of it, you make a mesh out of it and you put it in. And this mesh will slowly dissolve over time. But then, so that's the connective tissue. And then what they do is they put skin cells on top of it. And they actually have aerosolized skin cells now. You can like spray them on the surface, right? And then they just start growing. Freaking sci-fi is what that is right there. That's amazing. So they can actually, yeah, spray skin cells on the surface from other humans. Yeah. So that's what smart people do, just so you know. They make up crap like that. Okay. So now we are ready to move to the nervous system, which is my favorite. It's not most of my students' favorites until after they have already been tested on it. And then they're like, okay, maybe I liked it. But not during the time they're studying. They generally kind of hate me. And it's okay, because if I wanted to be popular, I wouldn't teach these classes, would I? No. I would teach easy classes. Okay, so let's talk about the nervous system and nervous tissue. So this is all in chapter 14. One of the things that you'll notice when you look in your textbook is the nervous system has 6 flippin' chapters, because there's so much to know about the nervous system, and it's very hard to know what's important. So they put everything in there. So what I did is actually narrow it down to the things that I know are going to be relevant to future classes or future clinical applications. So I'm definitely not teaching you the entire nervous system, but I'm trying to get you a good baseline for starting. So first thing I want to talk about is, what does the nervous system do? Nervous system functionality can really be categorized as 3 things. And so the way to think about it is to start with a very simple example, and I'm going to put my hand on a hot stove, and I'm going to try to remedy that issue. Okay? So a hand on a hot stove, there are 3 things that need to happen to remedy it. I need information N. That is called sensation, and that's one of the functions of the nervous system, right? Information in, okay? Into where? Into the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. And then what happens in the central nervous system is called integration, but really think of it as kind of like assessment. So what I'm doing is I'm sending that information in, and here's what happens in my brain for this information. Hand on a hot stove, information goes in. My brain is assessing the information, and it's identifying, it's like hot. And then it's assessing how hot. And then it's making a decision. Too damn hot. We need to do something about it, right? But you still haven't fixed the problem, have you? You just like identified the problem and a possible solution. You with me? So then the third step, so sensation, integration, and then the third step is the response, or the motor response. So I send a signal out to my muscle, right? And say, stimulate my biceps brachii and move your hand. And it all happens subconsciously and instantaneously, right? That makes sense? And I'm not going to test you over this part. Let's also acknowledge that the integration part of that is not always that simple, right? Because, for instance, we have consciousness, we have intellectual functionality, we have emotions, right? So let's see how that could work with this. It's a little harder to understand, but so let's say you are watching the presidential debates, right? And you're taking in that sensation, and you are going to have an integration. Your integration is going to be super complicated, and it's going to be based on your past, right? Based on your predispositions, based on your sense of humor, based on your exposure to other things. And so you're integrating all of that simultaneously before you actually do the response. And the response could either be anything from throwing your shoe at the damn television, right, to laughing your head off at the absurdity of it all. But that it's still a response, right? It's just that the integration can get really simple to outrageously complex. Like you could end up talking about the integration piece of it for multiple semesters, right? So we are not going to do that to you, but I just want you to acknowledge that the integration is not always just hot, how hot, too damn hot, or dumb, how dumb, too damn dumb, throw a shoe, right? Okay. So now let's start talking about the structural components of the nervous system. So to start out with the portions of the nervous system, you probably already know that, of course, the big anatomical divisions of the nervous system are central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Yes? Okay. So typically, very commonly abbreviated as CNS and PNS. Okay. And most people know that. So let's briefly talk about CNS versus PNS. Okay, so let's go back to the hand on the hot stove example. And what I want you to tell me is, in the context of this right here, the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. Yes, that's all that's in the central nervous system. And what the peripheral nervous system is all other nervous tissue in the body, all of it. Okay, everything that is not the brain and the spinal cord. And it is mostly made of nerves. And what are nerves? Nerves, think of them as wires. Okay, so what I'm going to tell you is, I'm going to put my hand on the hot stove, I'm going to send the information in, I'm going to say hot, how hot, too damn hot, and then send the information back out and respond to it. Okay, so what the nerves are is really the wires going to and from the sensory receptors and to and from muscles and glands. Okay, so now I want you to put this story in the context of the metaphor that I used. Sensation, integration, and response. Okay, I'm going to put his hand on a hot stove. Okay, and I'm going to send the information in. CNS or PNS is involved in the sensation part.
PNS.
Good. Integration is CNS. Response is PNS. Exactly. I mean, it comes from the central nervous system, but it's going through, right, the peripheral nervous system. So what would happen is the sensory receptors are going to be here. They are going to send a signal up through these nerves, ultimately to the brain. Could be the spinal cord too, but the brain, and the brain is going to do the integration, right? And then the brain is going to send the signal out a nerve to the biceps brachii, right? Does that make sense? So the vast majority of the integration, almost all of it, goes on in the central nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is really just fancy wiring, hooking you up to the thing that can actually make any decisions, right? Take in any information and assess it and make any decisions. I mean, there's a little bit more complexity to it than that, but it's a good way to start thinking about it. Okay, so let's go back to the CNS for a second. The CNS, the central nervous system, is the brain and the spinal cord. You already know this, but the brain is located in what body cavity? Cranial. And the spinal cord? Vertebral or spinal. Yeah, it is all dorsal, but the dorsal body cavity includes the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so now let's look at what the brain is made of, the brain and the spinal cord is made of. And we're going to get into this in more detail in the next set of notes, but just sort of conceptually, what is the brain and the spinal cord made of? So I'm going to take the brain right here, and I'm going to do a section of it. And if I show you this section, can you tell me what kind of section that is? Corona. That's a coronal section. So do you see the general pattern that we're going to see over and over again is that on the brain there is darker tissue on the outside and then lighter tissue toward the middle, right? And there's also some dark chunks in the middle. But it's darker tissue on the outside. We call that gray matter. Lighter tissue on the inside. We call that white matter. Okay, and they are structurally and functionally different. So what I want to try to get you guys to understand is what the hell is going on in gray matter and what the hell is going on in white matter. And then eventually we'll start putting it together with specific regions of gray matter and white matter. Okay, so that makes sense to you? So let's look at what's in the gray matter. So let's take a little chunk. This little chunk right here is a little bit of a hybrid between gray and white, but so let's take a little chunk. What's primarily in the gray matter is it is neuron cell bodies, right? This is where the neuron cell bodies are, and also some glial cells, but not much myelinated axons, not many myelinated axons. There are going to be some axons in there, but not many. So the gray matter, what I want you to think about is the gray matter is where the processing is going to go on, because your neurons are your electrically active cells, right? They're the ones that release neurotransmitters. They're the ones that would, for instance, be responsible for voluntary motor activity and decision making and even involuntary activity. So these are the things that are doing the integration, okay? Doesn't all happen on the surface, but that's a good way to start thinking about it, okay? So that is the gray matter. And then, so those are like making decisions, making things happen. So what is the white matter? Well, the white matter is parts of the brain are specialized, but what I need to do as a whole is keep myself alive, right? That's sort of what my ultimate goal is to keep myself alive. So I've got a region. Let's just talk about some functionality that we know is localized to one side or the other. So the right side of my brain will control activity of my left hand. Left side of brain will control activity of my right hand. But in order to pick something up, I need both of them, right? And I need both of them to be coordinated in an activity. So what I'm going to need is not just independent action of these two processors. What I'm also going to need is coordination between them. So does it make sense to you that I need wiring within the brain, right? The wiring. So the wiring within the brain is what the white matter is. So let me show you. So white matter, for instance, that connected the left and the right cerebral hemispheres would go through the middle. You guys with me? So let me show you what it would look like. This is one of my favorite pictures. I love it so much. It makes me so happy. This is the white matter connecting the left and the right sides of the cerebral hemisphere. And it's bundled into what we call tracks or pathways. So what I mean is if I'm going to try to pick something up and it needs coordinated activity of the left and right sides of my brain, I'm going to initiate my left hand activity from here and my right hand activity from there, and they need to coordinate it via the wiring that communicates between them. And this is the wiring that communicates between them. So what is the wiring structurally? If the gray matter is mostly neuron cell bodies and glial cells, the white matter is myelinated axons that actually connects them to each other, right? Does that make sense to you? Okay, so that's what the white matter is in the brain. And we will learn more about white matter later, but does it surprise you that we have white matter wiring that goes left to right, but we also have it that goes anterior to posterior, and we've also have it that goes superior to inferior structures all the way to the spinal cord, right? So there's a bunch of different directions that the wiring can go in the brain. So primarily what the brain is a collection of processors and wires between the processors, right? And the processors are gray and the wires are white. Does that make sense? Okay, so that is, I want this dissection. We tried to do it. One of my lab aides tried to do it. It's really freaking hard. First of all, the brain is just a freaking goo ball. It's like scrambled eggs, right? It's hard to like keep it together. And then getting some parts on while keeping others on. We're still working on it. And we're going to try to get one of these dissections in the lab. You have to like freeze it for a certain amount of time, and then you have to use some tools to do it. A brain is really an interesting texture. I'll show you guys a video of it when we start the brain. Okay, so sensation and motor activity, what does it have to do with the CNS? So let's just put that back together as a story. So every single sensation that you have has to come to the CNS for integration, but nobody said you had to be aware of all of them. So you are only consciously aware of any sensation that goes to your cerebral cortex, which is about 4 millimeters on the superficial surface of your brain. So for instance, right now you're actually monitoring your own blood pressure, but you're not sending it to your conscious self. You're sending it to a portion of the brain that is subconscious. So fascinatingly, the only part of you that is actually recognizable as you is the 4 centimeters on the superficial surface of your brain. The rest of your brain, you never even know that it's going on. Nobody ever tells you anything about it. You're monitoring your own pH right now. You're monitoring your own blood pressure. You're monitoring the stretch of your stomach, but none of that ever becomes conscious. Okay? So the only sensations you are aware of is the ones that go to the cerebral cortex. All motor activity comes from the cerebral cortex, all of it. Sorry, not from the cerebral cortex. All motor activity comes from the brain and the spinal cord, right? It's commanded from the brain and the spinal cord. And this is humbling too. You are only under voluntary control of a single tissue in your entire body, which is totally humbling to me. So you only can control a single tissue in your entire body, and what is that? You are only voluntarily in control of skeletal muscle. You can't do a damn thing about your smooth muscle contraction. You can't do anything about your cardiac muscle contraction. You can't make a gland secrete or not secrete. You can't do anything about it. The only tissue that you are in control of is your skeletal muscle. Arguably, you're not even in control of your own damn brain, are you? Because have you ever tried to stop thinking about something that you were thinking about? Your brain will betray you, will it not? You'll be like, I don't even want to think about that ever again. Your brain's no, we need to revisit it. We need to obsess about it. we need to pretend that everybody is always thinking about you and think about the thing that you said that was stupid 17 weeks ago, right? They're like, yes. So obviously you cannot, in large quantities, even control your own brain tissue. You can control skeletal muscle, but not all the time. So all sensations come to the CNS, but most of them don't go to the cerebral cortex. All motor commands come from the CNS, but the only ones that you actually get to decide on is skeletal muscle. Go ahead.
I'm just curious about how sleepwalking works, or any sleep activity.
Oh, that's an interesting thing. So, well, we can come back to that, but I'll give you a short answer. The short answer is that part of what happens in sleep with most of us is that you activate a part of your brain that shuts off your motor activity, right? And that's what happens with most of us. So for instance, you're relatively still during sleep, no matter what kind of like adventure you're going on in your head. But people with that sleepwalking disturbance, they have all of the same brain activity, but they do not inhibit the motor activity of their brain. So they continue to actually be active. It's a really interesting kind of dangerous thing that can occur. But they've actually done fMRIs on sleepwalkers, and the rest of us, that part of our brain that will allow us to take thoughts and move them into skeletal muscle activity is inhibited during sleep. And in those people, it's still really active during sleep, which is really interesting, right? So I told you I like the brain. Nervous system is my favorite. Okay, so now let's move to the PNS. The peripheral nervous system is all other nervous tissue in the body, but it's way simpler than the CNS because mostly what it is wiring. So let's look at it again and then we'll get it a little closer. So in the peripheral nervous system, you have hardly any neuron cell bodies, which should make conceptual sense to you because neurons are amitotic mostly, right? So where do you want to put them? Encased in bone and 3 layers of meninges and a fluid surrounding them, right? So they're all like relatively protected within the central nervous system. And so what's going out is just the wires that are going to and from the neurons. Does that make sense? So most of this is just wiring, and the neurons are almost, not all of them, but most of them are in the central nervous system. So there are a few neuron cell bodies in the PNS, and we'll learn about them later. And when they exist, they're usually little blobs. They look like little blobs on nerves, and that's called a ganglion, and plural is ganglia. But most of it is just wiring that's going to and from the central nervous system. So let's look at what a nerve is, okay? So let's take the biggest nerve in the body, which is this big honker right here, called the sciatic nerve, okay? And let's do a cross-section of that, and let's see what it's actually composed of. So a cross-section of that nerve would look like this. So ultimately, let's try to find something relevant in this cross-section of nerve. Here's the axon, right? And you know what an axon is. So now I want to tell you, here's what I'm talking about. So the neuron that is going to ultimately, let's say, control the muscle activity of my little toe, right? Okay, that's where I'm trying to get that. It's going to come from the central nervous system because it has to, right? But the neuron cell body is up here in the lumbar region of my spinal cord. Everybody with me? And then what do I send out to my little toe? Only the axon associated with that neuron is going all the way through the sciatic nerve and then branching and branching and branching and branching, and ultimately all the way down to that muscle in my little toe. So the neuron is up here and only the axon runs through there, right? Well, that's good because if I actually damage the axon, the neuron's still alive. You could potentially make another one, right? If I damage the neuron, do I get to make another one? No, not most of the time. So what is a nerve? Nerve's not just one axon. I have a lot of things that need to go on in my little toe. I have sensation and motor activity, and I've got more than one muscle down there, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bundle up a whole bundle of axons and wrap them in connective tissue so that they're actually protected, and that is what a nerve is. Okay, and it has a similar architecture to how muscles are. So here's an axon with its myelin sheath, and we'll talk more about the myelin sheath later. But superficial to the myelin sheath is a connective tissue coating called endoneurium. And then if I put a whole bunch of axons together, I call it a fascicle. And then I wrap it in connective tissue called perineurium. Exactly. And then if I wrap a whole bunch of fascicles together in connective tissue, I'm going to call it epineurium. The whole thing's called a nerve, right? But do you see that primarily what it is just a bunch of wires? So a really good metaphor for a nerve is a coaxial cable, which is a cable made of wires, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what a nerve is. Here's what a nerve looks like under scanning electron microscopy. So SEM, you can see this is a little myelinated axon there, and this is a whole fascicle. Got some blood vessels running through nerves too. Okay, so now let's talk about the cranial and spinal nerves and what this has to do with like your whole body functionality just generally before we get into the specifics. Okay, so the brain and the spinal cord are, with very few exceptions, where all of the processing and integration goes on, right? That means you always have to get the message to there, or the message is always going to come from there, right? Good? So I want you to think of the central nervous system like I-15. If you ever want to get anywhere in Utah, and if you ever want to get out of Utah, you've got to get on I-15, right? You do, right? So that means that ultimately, even if I was on the little bittiest driveway down a country road in Price, Utah, right, I should be able to find my way back ultimately to an on-ramp to I-15, yes? And there are limited numbers of on-ramps to I-15, right? So now what we're going to talk about is the nerves that come directly to and from the central nervous system. There are a limited number of them. The ones that are directly attached to the brain, right here, you can't see all of them right now. We'll learn them in detail later, but the nerves that are directly attached to the brain are called cranial nerves. Okay, there are 12 pairs. You will eventually know them by name and number and function, but not today. So those cranial nerves. So let's talk about what cranial nerves do. What cranial nerves do is, remember their wiring, right? So this is an oversimplification, and we'll find the exceptions later. But primarily what cranial nerves do is send sensation from the face and the head to the brain, like, right, for instance, vision goes through a cranial nerve to the brain, right? Hearing goes through a cranial nerve to the brain. But also does sensation, right? Goes through cranial nerve to the brain. But also motor activity comes from cranial nerves to the head. So where does this come from? Right? So you probably won't be surprised when you learn a little bit later that, for instance, the function of the orbicularis oculi is controlled through a cranial nerve. That make sense? Okay. So basically, sensory and motor stuff to and from the head is what cranial nerves do. But just so you know, even though there are 12 cranial nerves, that's not all the branching they do. There are 12 on-ramps and off-ramps, and then they branch and branch and branch and branch and branch until I have one little driveway to that little shack in Price, Utah, right there, okay? So it's going to branch and branch and branch. So there's no way in hell you would ever know all of the facial nerves, right? Unless like that were your specialty and you've been doing that surgery forever. But you can know the 12 on-ramps and off-ramps to the brain. Okay, so those are called cranial nerves. You'll eventually learn those by name and number and function. And then spinal nerves. Spinal nerves come off of the spinal cord, right? And so there's a limited number of on-ramps and off-ramps to the spinal cord, and those are called spinal nerves. They don't have individual names. They're usually labeled for where they come off, like C1, T1, thoracic vertebra number 1, like right where they come off. So we'll talk about their names later. But what I want to do is put it together with the story that you know about, for instance, paraplegia and quadriplegia, right? Spinal cord injuries, paraplegia, quadriplegia. This will help you understand what the spinal nerves do and how it's related to body functionality. So this is an oversimplification too, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. Usually when you're looking at spinal nerves, you look at a posterior view. I don't know why they're showing it from the anterior. So I've got some spinal nerves that are coming off really high. These are called cervical spinal nerves. Okay, this is a good general way to think about it. The nerves that are coming out here will generally do sensory and motor function to the things that are directly inferior to them. So, for instance, the nerves that are coming out here will control shoulder sensation and some of shoulder muscle function. Is that okay? And then the nerves that are coming out in the slightly lower cervical region right here are going to do arms, right? Does that make sense? Okay. The nerves that are coming out here are responsible for things that are slightly lower, okay? And then the nerves that are coming out here about the lumbar region and spinal cord are going to do leg functionality, right? Okay. So now let's bring that back to talking about spinal cord injuries. The way I think about spinal cord injuries is there's a bridge out. There's only one way to get to and from the highway, right? And ultimately what you're trying to do is get to the brain. So let's talk about, first, I want to talk about damaging the spinal cord right down here. Can you see that if this region right down here is leg function, I've got wires that are going to and from the legs. If all is working well, what would happen is, let's say, I would decide I wanted to do this, right? And I will send that from my brain, from the cerebral cortex, down through the spinal cord, out the wiring to control the muscles that were going to do that, right? Which is primarily the quadriceps femoris muscles that's going to do that kick. That makes sense? Okay. And then if I want to feel this, right, it would usually have to go up the same nerve, but a different wire in the same nerve, right? So now I'm going to damage my spinal cord, and I'm going to damage it right down here. Do you see that that is not going to affect arm function, right? Because that's not how the wiring works to the arms, right? But it is going to affect leg function, right? So what happens is, even if I activated a sensory receptor down here, is there any way that I can get to the brain to be aware that that occurred? No, because the bridge is out, right? I can't get it up past the spinal cord all the way to the brain. So I'm never going to become aware that it occurred. So can you tickle the foot of someone who has a spinal cord injury and they can't feel it? And then the other thing is, can I get, even if my brain said I want to kick a soccer ball and I try to send out the signal, the bridge is out. I can't actually get the signal all the way down there, right? Okay, go ahead.
What is temporary paralysis?
Temporary paralysis is usually just because of inflammation. Or it could have been because of damage to a nerve and not the spinal cord. So the problem with damaging the spinal cord and the brain is that it's A, amitotic, and B, the only highway in and out. But if you damaged it down here, you might be able to get around it, given a little time. Go ahead.
Well, my dad had an transient ischemic stroke,
Uh-huh.
so he was paralyzed completely on the right side of his body, but then it returned.
Oh, okay. So if it happens in the brain, one of the cool things, and we'll talk about this with brain functionality, is the brain has the capacity for what we call neuroplasticity, which is you can pass off the function to a different part of the brain. So even if you didn't get that part back, you can pass it off, right? You can say, I still want to move my arm. You need to pass it off to another part of the brain, right? Does that make sense? That's sometimes the reason it comes back. Also, sometimes the paralysis is temporary because it's just related to an inflammation. And when the inflammation goes away, the paralysis goes away. Okay, so now let's talk about higher spinal cord injury. So can you see if I damaged up here, I would still lose control of sensation and motor activity in the legs? Up here, more. Now I'm losing control of my intercostal muscles, for instance, right? You can probably see that that's where you would innervate your intercostal muscles. And now I'm going to damage all the way up here. Can you see that if I damaged right here, I might still have partial functionality of the arms, because do you see that some of the wires come from down low and some of them come from up high, right? So I might have lost partial functionality. And now I'm going to damage all the way up here by C3. All the way up there, all the way up here. Can you see that now I can, if it's completely damaged, I will not only be a paraplegic, I will be a quadriplegic, right? Because I can't get signals to and from my hands or to and from my legs, right? And do you also see the reason that even if it were mitotic, it's a much bigger deal to damage I-15 than it is to damage some road off of I-15, right? Because that's where all the signals have to come and go, right? Even if they could repair, it would be a big problem until they did, and they generally don't repair. If you take out the I-15, it's gone, right? Everybody moves away from the town, right? Okay, does that make sense? So that's sort of the structure-function relationship between the stuff that we are doing. A preview of things to come. In this set of notes, what we're going to try to do is just get down the terminology and the organization with the nervous system. Note to self, you're going to have to study nervous system more than you have other things in lecture. There's going to be more memorization, the terminology is unfamiliar, and it's hard to use, and it's clunky. So you can't just read it and be able to use it correctly. So get ready to write it, get ready to think about it, get ready to test, that kind of stuff. And then after we have done organization and terminology, then we'll move into brain function, right? And we'll start talking about brain function. And then after that, we'll do spinal cord and spinal nerve function. And so we will be ahead of lab because we'll get into brain function probably Wednesday next week, I think. That makes sense? Okay, so I will stop. And by the way, you will probably have a brain assignment over fall break. I won't grade it, but it takes a while to know this stuff. So if you practice it, you'll get a lot better at it.